Welcome to the section on EPIC and VLIW processors. So in this video, we will look at an important class of processors that actually use the compiler for most of their optimizations. So much of the hardware that we have seen is actually replaced by the compiler. So we'll start with a provocative question, which is that can we outsource the work of renaming and scheduling to the compiler? So I'll use the terms scheduling and scheduling together. So the key question is that two important functions that we were doing in hardware, namely renaming and scheduling the instructions, can they be somehow offloaded or outsourced to the compiler? So this will basically save hardware, right? So the key idea over here is that it's going to save hardware resources, and this may be extremely beneficial. So undoubtedly, this sounds like a very promising idea because the moment we have less hardware, we have less power and less complexity, right? So less hardware is always good. Also, modern software is quite fast. It is quite intelligent as well. And uh, given that we can do a lot of analysis kind of offline before the program has run, we can possibly generate a highly efficient piece of code and also give directions to hardware on how to rename and schedule instructions. So, what is the basic idea? So, the basic idea this kind of extends from what we have studied in ordered pipelines, right? Multi issue in order pipelines. So, you may want to go back and take a look at that way back in chapter 2. But I would say that we start from here, conceptually at least, from this point. So what we do is we create bundles of several instructions using the compiler. And the expectation is that we do not have dependencies within a bundle. And the entire bundle is scheduled in one go at one time. And let's assume that for the timing, all the dependencies are handled. So we'll take a look at them later. So in this space, there are two ideas. So the first idea, which is actually quite old, dates way back to the mid 80s, is known as VLIW. So modern avatar of VLIW is called EPIC. So let's discuss VLIW first and then we will go to EPIC. So VLIW stands for Very Long Instruction Word. These were the first designs in this space. So what we do is that we take an instruction or we take a set of consecutive instructions and we add more information such that they can direct the hardware to do different things at a low level. So this also is kind of a conceptual successor to microprogramming. So we bundle these instructions into long words. So let's say if we have a long memory word like this, then we can bundle the instructions. So let's say this is instruction 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. So when instruction is 4 bytes and we create a bundle of 4 instructions, then we'll essentially have a 16-byte word. All right. So we schedule and execute all the instructions together in a word. And it is assumed that the instructions are so designed or so arranged that there is no problem whatsoever. But problems will always be there. So what we will do here is that we will look at some of the patterns which can cause problems, some of the problematic patterns. So one of the patterns is conditional if statements. So in the case of a conditional if statement, the control flow is not predictable. All right. So we don't know at compile time whether the if part or the else part will actually be executed. So this will only be clear at runtime. So the control flow is consequently not predictable. And furthermore, we can have memory instructions whose addresses are computed at runtime. And as we have seen earlier in this chapter, there can be complex dependencies. Mainly because we are computing the addresses of memory instructions at runtime. So what is the basic philosophy of many of these VLIW processors? The basic philosophy is that it is the compiler's job to actually ensure correctness. So VLIW processors don't really take upon themselves the job of ensuring correct execution. You assume that the programs are simple, the compilers have enough visibility to ensure correctness, this being the most important and the most crucial. So let's take a look at some of the ways in which if statements are handled. So if you remember GPUs, so we use predicated execution over there. So we can do something very similar here. So let's assume that there is a bundle of 4 instructions. One of them is a branch, an if statement. So if it is taken, the rest of the instructions in the bundle are invalid, which means this instruction is invalid. So what we do is that instead of dynamically, doing more changes, we allow the rest of the instructions in the bundle to pass through the pipeline as if they were normal instructions. It is just that they are kind of marked with a bit, something similar to the poison bit that we have seen. They are marked with a bit, which means that the instruction is invalid. All right. So what we do is we still maintain the semantics of the bundle. And if there is an if statement over here, which is a taken branch, then the rest of the instructions in the bundle are just marked to be invalid. And they simply pass through the pipeline, but they don't change the architectural state. Memory instructions, well, we have seen that memory instructions could be quite problematic in the sense that we could have two memory instructions. And if you take a look at these memory instructions, their addresses are being computed at runtime. All right. So we can have multiple memory instructions in a bundle. The addresses, needless to say, are computed at runtime, and we could have hazards and dependencies. And so, regardless of the memory instructions, unless there are two loads, because we never have a read-read problem, but otherwise there could be issues. So we have to avoid such situations in either software or hardware. So we will take a look at very elaborate mechanisms to take this issue into account. So these were all about VLIW processors, where what we do is that we create a large group of instructions in software. We refer to the large group as a bundle. All right. The entire bundle of instructions is executed at the same time. It is just that VLIW processors do not guarantee correctness, and consequently, their usability is limited. As of today, they are mostly used in DSPs, digital signal processors, and multimedia processors. Okay. So they never saw a generic use. So, but let's say if we want to bring VLIW processors into the mainstream, which is an effort that was tried in the early part of the 2000 to 2010 decade by Intel and HP. So they made a very popular processor called Itanium, which was also called an EPIC processor. So EPIC is like the second generation of VLIW. It is explicitly parallel instruction computing. So in EPIC, the idea is that regardless of whatever the programmer or the compiler does, the hardware always ensures or guarantees correctness. This increases the load on the hardware, but it also improves the acceptability and the portability of the processor, right? So basically, it fares better in the market, mainly because more programs can run on it, and also compiler support can be slightly lax. So this is where VLIW ends and our journey of EPIC begins. So the Intel Itanium processor was a very unique collaboration between Intel and HP. The aim here was to design the first commercially successful and available EPIC processor. So one thing we need to understand that at the time that this processor was being designed, which is roughly the late 90s and early 2000, compiler technology was already quite mature. So that's the reason the best of software was already there. And also hardware technology also quite mature, but instead of investing the hardware resources in out of order execution, it was thought that it's a better idea to actually use the hardware for implementing an Epic like server. But the main idea was to target the server market, unlike VLIW processors that target specific applications. That was not the aim. All right, so the main aim was primarily server only. So, what was supposed to be removed was the scheduler, notably the instruction window, the wake up, select, and broadcast mechanisms. But we still needed some units from traditional processors, such as the branch predictor, the decode unit, execute unit, and also advanced load store handling units. So, those are still required because branches are something that you need to predict. And advanced load store handling is also required because memory addresses are resolved at runtime. So we look at the different stages of the Itanium processor. And of course, the best reference are the papers by Sharangpani and Arora on the Itanium processor. So Itanium had a high bandwidth fetch unit for those days. So we could read 32 bytes from the instruction cache in one go. 32 bytes are enough to fit 6 instructions. So it is possible to create 2 bundles of 3 instructions each. Given that the fetch rate is very high and the rest of the pipeline may not be able to process instructions at that rate, it is necessary to have a queue between the fetch stage and the rest of the pipeline. This was known as a decoupling buffer, where the decoupling buffer, could hold 8 such bundles. So it was possible to hold 8 such bundles in a decoupling buffer. All right. So one advantage of this is that even if there is a slight mismatch in the rates of fetching and the rates of processing, the decoupling buffer can sort of ensure that when we enter a high IPC phase, enough instructions are available. Branch predictors, needless to say, are required. Even if we do not have the elaborate broadcast wake up schedule units, branch predictors are required. We can't kind of wish away branch predictors. Titanium has 4 types of branch predictors. So let's look at them. So we'll look at 2 types in this slide. We'll look at the compiler directed predictors and the traditional predictor. So for the compiler directed predictors are those predictors where the compiler has more information. It figures out the direction of the branch and the target as well. And that is populated somewhere. So we have 4 special registers known as the target address registers or the TARs. The compiler populates them. So what does a TAR have? It has a PC and a target. Of course, it is assumed that the branch is taken. So moment that the program counter the PC matches the PC stored in that TAR, we jump to the target. We predict it taken and jump to the target. So this would happen, let's say, in cases where, so something like an exception handling code or something where most of the time we'll kind of jump out. In that case, it is a much better idea for the compiler to do some analysis and directly give a hint to hardware that a given branch is taken. And also it will jump to a given target. Here is the target, you take it. There is no need to actually do additional branch prediction or use a BTB because I'm giving you all the information that you need. So this is useful. This is useful. This is clearly the first priority. And it is useful in cases where it is possible for the compiler to come up with such information. Otherwise, we will use a traditional predictor. So the traditional predictor is a large PAP predictor, which we have seen in chapter 3, which basically means that the branch history register, PC bits go into that. which is the first level. And they also go into the second level that has the pattern history table. So in both the PC bits are used. So we have two more kinds of specialized branch predictors in Itanium. The reason being that fetch was seen to be a massive bottleneck. So if you think about it, Itanium is a very high IPC guaranteeing processor. So that's the reason you don't want the fetch to be the bottleneck. And given the fact that we are doing the best possible compiler analysis that we can, including profiling, we can do our best in ensuring that the rest of the pipeline doesn't face an issue because of the fetch stage. So here is the third kind of predictor, multi-way branch predictor, and a fourth, which is a loop exit predictor. So normally what happens is that a compiler would ensure that the last instruction in the bundle is a branch. So if this is a bundle, the last instruction in the bundle is a branch, such that taken or not taken, it doesn't matter. The bundle at least is correctly executed. But sometimes it can so happen that there are too many branches, we can have two branches. So in this case, let's say after this bundle, there can be many targets. One can be the default where both are not taken. One can be the bundle when the first branch is taken. One can be the bundle when the second branch is taken. All right. So we clearly, as you can see, we can have multiple targets. If there are multiple targets for a bundle, then what we need to predict is that, let's say, out of the branches that are there, which of them is taken, that we want to find the earliest branch that is taken and its target. So this is a multi-way branch predictor. So a multi-way branch predictor is there in Itanium. It's kind of constructed in a similar manner as the rest of the predictors that we have seen. But the broad idea is that out of all the possible options, it kind of gives you the most probable option such that we can start predicting from that point. Then we have a loop exit predictor. So normally what happens is in many scientific codes, we have a loop and the number of iterations of the loop, this is known beforehand, the compiler knows it. So in this case, what it can do is that it can have a small loop iteration register or a loop count register. It can be populated with the initial value of the loop count. And we can always, of course, given a piece of code, find the branch that leads to the loop. That is easy to find. Okay, so this can be, in this case, this is marked by the compiler. Even otherwise, any branch that normally has a negative offset within a small range, we can think of that as a loop branch. So the key point over here is that the predictor will keep on decrementing. So we'll have a register where the initial value of the count will be loaded, which is the number of iterations of the loop. Every time we arrive at this loop instruction, this will get decremented until it reaches 0. So when it reaches 0, what we have seen in our discussion in chapter 3 is that we normally make a misprediction. But in this case, we will not make a misprediction. Instead, we will make the correct prediction, primarily because the loop count has become 0. So now we know that at some point, wherever we do the check, we are actually exiting the loop. And that loop exit can be predicted correctly. So one of those one odd errors that happen when we either enter a loop or when we are exiting a loop, they will also not happen. So we are removing those sources of errors as well. All right, so now just a quick summary. We have 4 branch predictors: compiler directed, a traditional large PAP predictor, a multi-way branch predictor to figure out which branch in the bundle is taken, the first one, and a loop exit predictor dedicated to loops. So now let's look at this part of the pipeline. So we have looked at the fetch stage. Then we have instruction dispersal. So instruction dispersal is kind of like dispatching instructions to different functional units. So you can think of it as a combination of dispatch and issue, but it's called dispersal over here in EPIC literature. And then register remapping, which is something conceptually similar to the renaming that we do, of course, with major differences. So let's look at the details of the hardware first. The Itanium has 9 issue ports, 2 for memory instructions, that is 2 for integer, 2 for floating point, and 3 for branch. right, to find whether a branch condition evaluates to true or not. So you can see the disproportionate amount of resources that have been dedicated just for branches. The reason is that the designers of Itanium took the fetch bottleneck quite seriously. Dispersal of the instructions, as we have just discussed, is mapping the instructions to the issue ports such that they can be sent to their functional units. Of course, here we need to be mindful of data hazards. A data hazard in a bundle of three instructions can be there, so we would try our best not to have them. But the code might be such that we would still have data hazards, right? So there is no going around it. So the code might be such that there is nothing that we can do to avoid data hazards. In this case, we have the traditional option to fall back to, which is no op instructions. Or, of course, we can forward. So there is an ample amount of forwarding within Itanium's pipeline. So that is not something that should worry us. But in some cases, like the load use hazard and so on, what we have seen, there are, of course, many more specialized cases in Itanium where forwarding is not really possible. So in this case, we use stop bits. So what happens is that with every instruction, we have a stop bit. So we look at the instructions across bundles. The stop bits could be something like this. So what this pattern is essentially trying to tell us that if, let's say, all of the instructions between two consecutive ones, they are independent of each other. So the hardware can take all of these and schedule them in any way that it wants because there is no dependency between any pair of instructions. Stop means that it's like a dependent stop. Okay, a stop because of a dependence, which essentially means that it sequentializes the execution. So as long as there are a bunch of zeros, we execute them in parallel. Then we stop. We execute this instruction. Then we execute this. Then again the next four we execute in parallel. Again we execute this instruction. So on and so forth. So it is a job of the compiler to insert these stop bits. And it is the job of the hardware to interpret the stop bits, find all the consecutive zeros or instructions with consecutive zeros as their stop bits and execute them in parallel. Along with that, Itanium also annotates each bundle with the resource requirements. So for every bundle, it is annotated with the resource requirements, what it would require. So anytime that the scheduling happens, the hardware checks that, figures out the resource requirements. And then on the basis of that, it does the process of issuing the instructions. So essentially, the resource requirements help us avoid structural hazards. Finally, we come to the register remapping stage. The register entry in Itanium is quite special, it's quite different. So first is we have a large number of registers similar to GPUs. Of course, GPU registers were truly virtual in the sense we assume that there are a very large number of registers. Here we are not making that assumption, even though we are making something quite similar. So the first is that we divide these 128 registers into two parts. 32 static registers and 96 stacked registers. The static registers are visible to all functions. So all the functions can see and access these static registers. Whereas the stacked registers are pretty much meant to have the state of a single function. So they are not really visible. And they are also managed in a special way, which we will shortly discuss. All right, so here there's a very, very limited visibility across functions, very limited. So what we do is that we allocate different sets of these virtual registers in the stacked region to each function. And then because we avoid different sets, we have a large number of registers, right? So we can, even if you have multiple functions that are alive at the same time, they can be assigned different registers. So because they are assigned different registers, we don't have register spilling into memory the normal way that we have. That is because First, we have too many registers, and second, different functions are given different registers within these set of stacked registers. So this idea is also known as a register window, which means that every function is given its set of private registers to work with. You can, so Spark calls it a registered window, so we'll also do that. So let's take a look at an example. So the example will make it quite clear. Assume that the function foo is calling the function bar. So what we do is that we take a set of registers, right? And we map them like this, that we divide them into three sets. The in registers are the ones in which the parameters are passed into the function. The local registers are the ones that are used to store internal variables and do computations and so on. And the out registers are the ones that are used to essentially send parameters to functions that this function invokes, the callee functions. So since foo calls bar, what we actually do, so what you are seeing over here, these are the virtual register numbers. So what we actually do, similar to virtual memory, we map this register over here to this register over here. So we just map them. So one advantage of mapping them in this fashion is like this, that basically similar to sharing a virtual memory page, both of these registers actually become the same. So the moment the foo function writes something over here, this automatically is visible to the bar function, which is of course invoked at some point of time by foo. But bar automatically finds its input argument over here in this register. All right. So what you can see is that the same. So these are virtual registers, but two different virtual registers are mapped to the same physical register. So as a result, one write is automatically visible to the called function. And then the callee over here, which is bar, it again has its set of local registers and out registers. So what is being done over here is that we are deliberately creating an overlap in the virtual register set of two functions to pass parameters. And there is, similar to virtual memory, there is a manager, manager in hardware and software to manage the set of registers, right? To ensure that these mappings are created, right? To manage that, we have a management mechanism. We'll talk about that later. But the key idea is that passing parameters and functions and passing function parameters is quite easy. Basically, we take the set of virtual registers, partition them into three types: in, local, and out. And the out registers are mapped to the in of the callee function, and that's how values are passed. So we have a register stack frame. So what happens is that the in and the local registers are preserved across the function calls. As you have just seen, the out registers are used to send parameters to callee functions. We have an alloc instruction in Itanium. It automatically creates a register stack frame for a function, right? So that is how the stack frames are allotted or allocated. So currently, let's not talk about overflows, because recall that we have only 128 registers. Out of 128, we have 32 registers called static, and we have 96 registers called stacked, which are precisely being used for this purpose. Coming to return values, I would first like to motivate the mechanism by showing the code of a binary search program. So if you see the binary search program over here, so what does it do? What it does is that it takes in an array, it takes a left pointer, a right pointer, it searches for the value within it. So after doing some sanity checks, it finds the midpoint. It compares the value with the midpoint. If let's say the value is less than array mid, then we basically run binary search over this half and return the value that it returns. So if you look at this function, it invokes the binary search routine for the left half. Whatever that returns, it also returns. So the return value is not further processed. Similarly, if the value is, let's say, greater than mid, then we focus on the right half. And once there is a match, whatever the right half returns, this function also returns. So if you think about it, in the calling path, of course, a lot of computation is happening. But in the return path, whatever the callee function is returning, which is essentially the same function, albeit with smaller arguments, the value is just being transparently passed through. So let's now understand some critical aspects of the register stack frame. The in and local registers are clearly preserved across function calls. The out registers are used to basically send parameters to callee functions. So once the callee function has used them, we don't really care. And what we have discussed in the past is an alloc instruction is used to create a register stack frame. Communicating return values is slightly tricky, but if we, let's say, take the previous example as a representative, it is a much better idea for, let's say, whoever produces the value, let's say that this instruction over here. So you have to see where the recursion is terminating. The recursion is terminating at these two statements. So since the recursion is terminating over here, either at return -1 or return mid, then we can think of these as the final return statements. And then whatever they are returning, it just coming back until this point. So it is much better if we directly have a shortcut from here to, let's say, over here, and we can completely skip the rest of the functions. So what we will do is that we will store the return values in a static register. So recall that this is a register in the static area, which is the first 32 registers. So the return value can be stored at any point over here. In this case, we can directly jump to the return address in the main function, which is basically directly jump over here. And whatever is a result of the binary search will directly be assigned to the variable result. So that's the reason it is good to have the return value in an area which is not within the register stack frame, but it is within the static region. And then, well, we can quickly resume processing the return value of binary search. So that's the reason we allocate a separate area. So I'm not saying that for all function calls, the binary search example is representative. In fact, there's a very famous pattern. It is called tail recursion. So this pattern is known as tail recursion. And if we directly jump from, let's say, this point and then set the value of result, this will be known as tail recursion elimination. So it may appear that this scheme is kind of disproportionately biased towards tail recursion. But there are many similar patterns kind of throughout codes. And of course, a lot of analysis was done. So it was found out that for return values, we can safely keep it in a space which is not in the stack, such that it can be processed not just by this function, but by other functions as well. And then we can return back quickly. Right? So in that case, we don't really have to copy values across registers or restore from memory or do anything of that type. So that is why a separate storage region was provided for return values. Let us now look at some more issues. So let's first take a look at the first problem. Let's say we run out of registers. So the reason we'll run out of registers is because, as I've discussed, we have a stacked register storage area. And the local state of all the functions, at least that are currently active, is going in there. And since we only have 96 registers in this area, we might run out of registers. So the fun part over here is that Itanium has a register stack engine and RSE, which automatically handles the spilling of registers to memory and restoring them. So which is actually great. So this means that the compiler or the user don't really have to be bothered with this aspect of writing code. So they can happily write code, and then a dedicated engine will just manage the communication of registers to and from memory. Right? So this is, let's say, a major assistance that is being provided to the assembly language programmers and the compiler, that this is being done automatically. So basically handling the function state to a large extent is being done quite easily and quite automatically. Now coming to software pipelining. So in software pipelining, if you would go back a few slides, you would see that we use separate registers for the same variable across different iterations. The reason is that we are essentially taking instructions from different iterations, executing them together. So for the loop variable particularly, we use separate registers such that its value is updated correctly. This issue in Itanium is taken care of automatically. So we have a rotating register set. So this is the key innovation over here. Which is the rotating register set. Okay. So we assign registers based on the loop iteration number. So as we have discussed earlier, in the case of the loop exit predictor, we can very easily predict what is the current iteration number. Well, why? That is because the compiler annotates the loops, right? So you can also find it ourselves by looking at backward branches, but in this case, the compiler annotates. So at least the loop iteration number is always known. Depending upon the loop iteration number, we can use the appropriate register from the rotating register set, which is, think of it as exactly the same thing that we were doing in software pipelining. It is just that at that point we were using more registers, compiler was generating all this extra code. All of that goes away because the hardware takes care of it. So this makes it significantly easier to write software pipeline loops, because the key problem, which was to assign different registers to different iterations, is being taken care of. Next comes the high performance execution engine. So in this case, we don't have an instruction window, we don't have a wake up, select, broadcast mechanism. So these are things that we do not have. These are things that we don't have. Instead, what we have is we have a scoreboard. A scoreboard is something which was kind of in vogue in the late 70s. After that, it was not used, but it's a very fast and it's a very power efficient mechanism of scheduling instructions. In this case, a scoreboard was found to be a good solution. So I'll tell you quickly what a scoreboard is. It's clearly much simpler than the regular out of order execution mechanism. All that it does is that, consider it as a queue where instructions are entered like this. It makes an instruction wait until it is safe to execute. So we store its source registers, destination register, the functional unit that it is going to use, and whether it has completed or not, right? A 0 or a 1, that's all. We just store these 5 fields for the instruction, and this is implemented as a queue. All right, so now if we look at this, what we do is we allow an instruction to go through, or we allow an instruction to execute only if certain conditions hold. What are the conditions? That we check all the earlier entries. For each earlier entry E, the following expression should be false. All right. So first is, so what should be false? E dot finished equal to 0, which means that it is unfinished, not finished. And E dot RD, E's destination is same as the destination of the current instruction, which is I. So I is always the current instruction. So this means that we can have a write after write hazard, because there exists an earlier instruction that is writing to the same register, and that earlier instruction is not finished. So this condition over here, which is E dot finished equal to 0 and E dot RD is equal to I dot RD, this condition has to hold false. Fair enough. We can create a similar set of conditions for the rest of the hazard types. So like right after read hazard, same thing, check the earlier entries. For each earlier entry E, the following expression should be false. So E dot finished is equal to 0, which means it's unfinished. And either the source of RS1, I mean, its source is equal to I's destination, RS1 is equal to I's destination, or RS2 is equal to I's destination. So this is a typical write after a read kind of scenario. So in this case, we just need to create a circuit to verify all of these Boolean equations or Boolean expressions. And on the basis of this, we need to figure out if there are any earlier entries with which we can have a war hazard or not. If there are, then we don't schedule and we wait. A similar expression for an RAW hazard, the rest remaining the same, the instruction should be unfinished. And in this case, E dot RD should be equal to I dot RS1 or E dot RD or E's destination should be equal to the current instruction second source. So either it's equal to the current instruction's first source or second source. So this is a typical read after write scenario. And on similar lines, a structural hazard is again when the instruction is unfinished, not finished, and the functional units are the same, right? So instructions wait in the scoreboard until they are safe. I'm sorry, they should be they are safe, and there are no hazards. Okay, so they wait in the scoreboard until there's complete safety. There are no hazards. So there's a parallel scoreboard unit that keeps on checking this, and once an instruction is safe, it is executed. So now let's take a look at a few more aspects of the Itanium's execution pipeline. So consider the following piece of code. We kind of flip a random coin. If it is 0, then we execute this instruction, x equal to y, otherwise we execute this instruction. So in this case, the probability of a branch misprediction is very high. It's close to 50% because the output is from a random process. So if you flush the pipeline after every branch misprediction, it would be quite unfair. Why would it be quite unfair? Well, the reason is that this is a very high overhead, heavy duty operation where the entire ROB is flushed, the entire state is flushed. We'll lose a lot of data, we'll lose a lot of information, a lot of work. So what we can do is we can let the if statement just be used to mark an instruction with the result of the comparison, in the sense that we can simply mark an instruction and say that, look, either the comparison succeeded or it didn't, and we store the result in a flags register as we typically do. The rest of the instructions, which means in this case, this instruction and this instruction, both are processed regardless of the branch outcome. But it is just that this instruction is marked with basically the output of the if statement. So we'll take a look at an example. So what we normally do is that this is known as a conditional or a predicated instruction. So in this case, if let's say we will use a move instruction to move this value over here, then we can say move equality, in the sense if there was an equality in the last comparison, then only this move will happen, otherwise it will not happen. And on a similar note, here we can say move any. This would basically mean that, well, we'll move the value of z to x only if the previous comparison over here was not successful. So in this case, if you see, we are processing both the instructions, but both the instructions have an additional flag, or let's say have some additional information where we go and check the result of this comparison. In a sense, there is a degree of annotation which goes and checks, and only if the result has gone in a certain way is the instruction actually executed. All right, so some may modify the architectural state, some may not. But the key idea is that we will use these conditional instructions such that we can process these instructions. So one advantage is that just in case there is a branch misprediction, there is no need to flush the pipeline. In fact, what we do is that we just store the result of this in a flags register, right? So then we don't use branches. The subsequent instructions which use the two opcodes move EQ and move NE simply check the flags instruction, and in this case, since the flags will say that, look, it resulted in an equality, if it actually did, the move will happen. In the other case, if it didn't result in an equality, the move will happen. So I'm showing a small piece of code over here, which is the code without predication. So in this case, what we do is that we take the value, input value in R0. We compute this expression, R0 percentage 2, which means we take its modulo with respect to 2. If it's, then we compare it with 0. So if it's an even number, we jump over here. Just note the extra instructions and the branches, right? So they cause trouble. If it's an even number, we move the value in R2. So we assume y is stored in R2 into R1 and we exit. If it's an odd number, then we move the value stored in R3 into R1 and then we exit. So note the fact that we have an unconditional branch over here. So that has its set of problems. And we have a conditional branch over here, which has major problems in the sense that if we mispredict it, then the entire pipeline has to be flushed. So the code that you're seeing over here is exactly the implementation of the code over here. So I'll just maybe clear off the ink. So what you can see is that the code over here is very similar, where the value of rand is stored in the register R0. So here we compute the modulo, compare, and do a bunch of jumps to implement the logic. What we can do, which is actually much simpler, and this is something exactly on the lines of what many processors, not just Titanium, but even ARM processors are also doing it these days, is that, well, we first compute the modulo. So we first compute R0 percentage 2 and store it over here. Then we compare the result with 0. Then what we do is that we store these two. These are called predicates. We have also been calling them flags. So they're stored in the dedicated registers. So these predicates are stored in two registers, PO and PE, where if it is odd, the PO is set, where if it is even, PE is set. Then what we do is that in the odd case, or let's say for the odd case, which as you can see is this case, right, where we set it. If I were to just go back, this is the even case over here. This is the odd case over here, where X is set to Z. And so then we come here and then come here. So if the odd predicate is set, we move R3 to R1, which is essentially the value of Z. And this is set over here. And then we have the even case, where the even predicate is set. So note that only one of these predicates can be set. So the even case is set. Then we move R2 to R1. So in this case, there are no branches, there is nothing, so there is no possibility of flushing the pipeline. And as you can see, if the predicate is correct, the instruction will get executed, otherwise it will not. So this is similar to the previous example that we showed with move EQ and move ME, which is similar to the ARM terminology that was explained in the first part of the book. Not this book, but the previous one on undergraduate computer architecture. But the key point over here is that the predicate registers capture the outcome of the prediction. And if, let's say, the given predicate register, if its value is 1, as set by the CMP, then only this instruction will execute. Otherwise, it will just flow and pass through the pipeline without changing the architectural state. We can also have nested branches, an if and then an if within it, and so on. There could be multiple predicate registers. So an instruction will get executed and it will change the architectural state only if and only if all the predicate registers associated with it are 1. So it will take an AND of them. And if all of them are 1, then only it will get executed. So here is a summary of the pipeline as far as we have seen up till now. So in this case, we have our iCache and fetch engine. We have a decode unit. We also have a decoupling buffer whose main job is to separate the fetch unit from it. And we have a branch predictor. We have seen that we have 4 kinds of branch predictors: compiler directed, a large PAP branch predictor, a multi-way branch predictor, and a loop exit predictor. Then we have the instruction dispersal and register remapping logic. So dispersal essentially assigns it to the issue port. So we have a fair amount of support and also resources for the branch and predicate units. So the branch units compute the result of branches and predicates as well. We have 128 integer registers divided into 32 plus 96, right? Static and stacked. Something similar with FP registers, floating point registers. So the Itanium processor also has SIMD units. And then along with integer ALUs and FP ALUs, we connect the integer registers to an L1 cache. So we'll discuss the advanced load address table mechanism. So this is something that we have not discussed up till now. But we have discussed the rest. We have discussed the scoreboard, which schedules and orchestrates the execution. We have discussed predicated execution. So what we'll not discuss is the exception handler. So the exception handler happens if there is an interrupt from the keyboard or something. And finally, the processor over here, the EPIC processor, interfaces with the memory system via the L2, L3 caches and the bus controller. So the only major part, the only major chunk or the only major component that is remaining is the load store mechanism. So this is quite intricate. So what we do is that if we, let's say, take the value of a load, we boost it up in the program. In the sense, if the program, the load appears over here, we move it up. And along with that, we also maybe move up some instructions that may use its value. Because the good reason is that loads are almost always on the critical path. Hence, if we boost them up and we kind of get their data early, and then, if we are ready with the output of the load, many more instructions which are dependent on the load, they can begin to execute. And so we will basically have a higher degree of ILP, right? So that is the reason a lot of loads whose, let's say, value either we can predict or we can predict that there are no dependencies, we boost them up. Once they are boosted up, in the sense that they are in a point of the program where they should not be, there could be several problems. In the sense, if they are boosted over here, there could be stores in this region that write to the same address, and in that case, there will be an error. Right? So what are we doing? We have a regular program over here. We have a load over here. The load is being boosted up over here. Why? Such that the value comes of the load comes in early, and all the instructions that are dependent on the load, they can get their value, right? So they can start execution early. The only spoiler could be if there are other store instructions that appear over here. In this case, this will be incorrect. So what we do is that any load that is boosted, we put it in the advanced load address table or the ALAT. Subsequently, whenever there is a store, it checks for the ALAT for an address match. If it finds it, it will kind of mark that entry as dirty. In the original position of the load, which is much later, instead of the load, we'll have a load check instruction, which will check the ALAT and find if the load is still valid or not. Why will it not be valid? It will not be valid if there has been some intervening store to the same address, which will signal an error, basically. In this case, if there is no error, we are fine. Then, boosting up the load has been a successful operation. Otherwise, what we do is all the instructions of the load and its forward slice that we took up, at this point, which is the original point, we again re-execute the load and its forward slice. All right. So this is the basic idea of boosting up a load, which means kind of do it early. Something similar. This is something conceptually quite similar to, let's say, latency speculation or dependence speculation in the LSQ. But of course, in that case, we had a dedicated hardware, we had an LSQ and all of that. In this case, we don't, but at least the idea is quite similar conceptually, at least if you see that the compiler is kind of boosting up the load, but it's not completely forgetting it. It's putting it in an ALAT, and any subsequent store to the same address, that will also check the ALAT and basically indicate that there has been an error. But the error will be fixed. In the sense, when we reach the original point, we will again check for the load. If it's still valid, if it hasn't been invalidated by a store, then we will fix the error by reissuing the instructions. All right, so this brings us to the conclusion of this chapter. So I'll quickly go through the 5 most important points. So there are four kinds of aggressive speculation. We have discussed all four in great detail. First is we can speculate on the load address, no doubt. Dependencies in a load store queue. Load latencies in the sense we can predict it will hit an L1 cache and then do something about it. And finally, value prediction, right? So these are the four major mechanisms. If there is a mistake, we need not flush the entire ROB. There are three methods of replay that we looked at. Non-selective replay, kind of shooting machines with an AK-47. Delayed selective, slightly more selective, reduces the amount of wasted work. And token-based replay, where we have an exact idea of the forward slices. So this minimizes the wasted work. After increasing the complexity, we reduced it. So we first looked at hardware solutions, which is the ARF-based design, where we use the ROB as the physical register to buffer temporary values. So we found that, it's simpler, but of course, in this case, values are much larger. And we are communicating values, whereas in the PRF-based design, we never communicated values. Values are quite wide. As opposed to a 7-bit physical register, a value can be 64 bits, which is quite wide. We further simplified, we went down to the compiler level, we looked at a large number of optimizations, starting from common sub-expression elimination, constant folding, strength reduction, to software pipelining. These ideas were conceptualized in an EPIC processors when we discussed Itanium, where we kind of saw everything come together. So we saw a piece of hardware that supports quite advanced concepts. It supports register windows, for example, right? And tail recursion elimination, which comes as a part of that. It supports the idea of rotating register sets for automatically supporting software pipelining. It supports load boosting and a bunch of other things, a bunch of other really cool features that it has. So EPIC processors like Itanium did have their heyday. They survived for quite some time, and there was a lot of buzz around them. But gradually they fell out of favor. And one reason could be, well, I can only conjecture at this point because I don't have the information. By 2005 or so, the hardware technology was quite mature and it did not really require advanced compiler support. So the hardware technology, even with decent open source GCC like compiler support, was able to give very good performance, and that too at a very good, let's say, performance per watt or performance per dollar kind of price point. So the industry really didn't see the value of moving to a technology or a platform which was totally new. So you can see that, you can think about this, that any industry has a fair amount of inertia, and whenever any revolutionary technology comes, such as Itanium, even the Itanium to a large extent was made compatible with existing ISAs and so on. It's not that like that effort was not done. But as I said many times, many good and revolutionary ideas get stuck up in this inertia where the industry as a whole doesn't want to move. So something similar happened, but this is clearly not the end of processors like this. So we will see many more such efforts in the processor design space. We just need to look out for great new ideas that will keep coming. So this finishes chapter 5. So our entire discussion on processor design is over now. So we will next move to GPUs, graphics processors.